Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 281, The Heir. Alright, well, if you're tired of science, good news, we're heading back to political history. If you're not, also good news, scientific history becomes a larger portion of our show from here on out. So if we go back about 6 months now in time, prior to our episodes on the scientific revolution, you might recall that we left Europe really after the death of 4 monarchs, 4 autocrats: Henry VIII, Francis I, Charles V, and Sulieman the Magnificent. These 4 men absolutely dominated Europe for the first half of the 16th century. But now our story changes dramatically. Instead of long-reigning, powerful monarchs, our story shifts to a series of weak and young rulers who, with the exception of Philip II of Spain, tend to die quickly, leaving repeated power vacuums. Often, these vacuums come at difficult times, as Europe now transitions from the early Reformation to the age of religious wars. France is about to erupt into sectarian violence. The 30 Years' War is but moments away. And England, where we will begin today, is about to experience some serious religious whiplash. I'm going to do my best to tell the story of the second half of the 16th century as coherently as possible, while still keeping everything moving forward. That will, however, require some back and forth occasionally as I introduce new characters into our story. We're going to begin in England, where Edward VI's regency follows Henry's long and, at least at the end, often troubled reign. As we will see beginning today, at the death of Henry VIII, England's Reformation remained very much an open question. But by the close of Edward's brief rule, there was no going back. When Edward was born on October the 12th, 1537, Henry VIII's 27-year wait for an heir had come to an end. The English writer Richard Morrison reflects as follows, quote, "We have a prince. Can any man that dare to vouch himself to be a right Englishman hear this and not feel within himself such a wonderful force, an inerrable strength of gladness? Can his body be born in England, and here his heart not leap for joy? Can there lie any vein so far, so hid in a corner, but it shall hear and feel the blood heated, now much lighter to run, even as though it were a carrier of this good news?" End quote. In the royal collection in England, there's a painting called The Family of Henry VIII. It was painted around 1545, so at the tail end of Henry's reign. We don't know by who. Henry is there, sitting on his throne, beneath the royal canopy and the marble columns of Whitehall. To the left is his deceased wife, Jane Seymour, who kneels, and to his right is the sole male heir and child, Edward, standing. In the wings of the chamber, noticeably detached from the scene, are Henry's 2 other daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. They're both been proclaimed illegitimate in the complicated history of their father's reign. The message here is clear. Nearing the end of his life, Henry saw the future of the Tudor dynasty in the hands of his son, the soon-to-be proclaimed Edward VI. Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn had been painted out of history. According to this painting, at least, Henry's only rightful queen was Jane, the matriarch of the dynasty. When he died 2 years later, it was in his will, we'll talk about that he be buried next to Jane, and a monument was to be erected above with carved effigies of them as if, quote, sweetly sleeping, end quote. Of all of his wives, only she had done her duty. Only she had provided him with the only thing that mattered, a son, Edward. Henry joined her in the grave, assured that he had secured his dynasty with the male heir he had craved so long. Henry's death was supposed to be a sign that all was right with the world, thanks to Edward's birth. All was secure. England was stable and prosperous. After all, no one wanted to return to the Wars of the Roses. Note, some of this is about to be recapped from our Henry VIII episodes, but let's go ahead and quickly get back up to speed. Henry VIII never underestimated the importance of a male heir. It was a lesson that he learned at an early age. The turn of fortune's wheel could be cruel, and it had been when he was only 10 years old. Then the sudden death of his older brother Arthur, back in April of 1502, propelled Henry into the limelight. Henry's life changed dramatically. He was never meant to be king, nor had he even been prepared. For the sensitive and mild-mannered young child, a career in the church was probably what was ahead of him. Now, as a Prince of Wales and the sole male heir of the Tudor dynasty, he was kept so closely guarded that a Spanish envoy remarked how he might have been a girl, locked away in his chamber and only allowed to speak when answering his father. Arthur's death was a devastating blow for his father, Henry VII. His victory over Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field back in 1485 had, unequivocally, seemingly, ended half a century of civil war known as I mentioned, the Wars of the Roses. Yet, if we'll remember, throughout Henry VII's reign, new claimants to the throne kept springing up, challenging his legitimacy. For 15 years, Henry battled for his new dynasty to be recognized by the ruling empires of Europe. He married his oldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the rulers of powerful Spain. Nevertheless, Henry had always struggled to fit in amongst his own subjects, and particularly his nobility, the ruling families, around whom there were about 50, and upon whose support the monarch was largely dependent. We have to remember that Henry VII wasn't raised in England. He was raised in Brittany, part of France. He was an outsider who brought with him new styles of government from overseas, and was considered to be many a royal pain in the butt. He scrutinized every single payment that went through his chamber with his own hand. For what it was worth, Henry's penny pinching earned him little respect and fewer friends. As I mentioned before, he is the only early modern English monarch not to get a play from Shakespeare. With only one male heir to fall back on, and a child at that, Henry knew that the Tudor name was seriously under threat. Yet worse still was to come the following year, when his wife Queen Elizabeth died in childbirth, attempting to deliver another precious son. The Tudor dynasty hung dangerously by the thread of his only son's life. With no other male heirs, extinction of the royal line loomed close, and behind that, a return to civil war. The effects of all of this upon the young mind of Henry VIII, I don't think we can overstate. For when he came to the throne 6 years later, about 18 years old, he was determined never to repeat his father's mistakes. Now, the only good news for Henry and England was that Arthur's death meant Henry gained a wife, Catherine of Aragon, Arthur's widow. Almost immediately, Catherine became pregnant with Henry's child and gave birth to a boy named Henry on January the 1st, 1511. But the child lived only 7 weeks. The next time, it took a lot longer for Catherine to become pregnant. Still, in 1516, she gave birth to a child who would finally live past infancy. The only problem was that this child was a girl, whom the couple named Mary. It was not long thereafter, however, that Henry initiated divorce proceedings with Catherine, broke with Rome, and married Anne Boleyn. Likewise, though, Anne gave birth to a healthy baby girl named Elizabeth. But her failure to produce a male heir doomed Anne's fate, as we know. Henry quickly took up with another wife, this one Jane Seymour. She became pregnant in 1537. When her pregnancy reached its final stages in that year in September, the plague was raging in London, so Jane went into seclusion. On October the 12th, she gave birth, finally, to a healthy, relatively speaking, baby boy, Edward. The celebrations in London, when the news hit the streets, carried on well into the night, and you can imagine why. No one wanted to go back to the Wars of the Roses. On Monday, October 15th, Edward was christened in the royal chamber at Hampton Court. Suddenly, all seemed right with the world. Celebrations at court continued for a week. In his prolonged state of euphoria, Henry created 6 new knights and raised Jane's brother, Edward Seymour, to the Earl of Hertford. Yet 2 days after the christening, Jane fell seriously ill. Rejoicing now turned to prayer. On Friday, the 19th of October, there was a general procession at St. Paul's, quote, for the health of the Queen, end quote. Henry postponed a hunting trip that was kind of a big deal for him. He had planned to mark the start of the season, but only temporarily. Nevertheless, the doctors seemed hopeful for Jane's recovery. If she survived the night, they believed, she would be, quote, past danger, end quote. But this prognosis came too soon. On Wednesday, the 23rd of October, Jane suffered what they called a, quote, natural lax, end quote, most likely heavy bleeding. Throughout the night and into Thursday morning, her condition worsened dramatically. She spent the morning with her confessor, who now prepared to give her the last rites. At 8 o'clock that same evening, Henry rushed back to the chamber. The Duke of Norfolk wrote hurriedly to Thomas Cromwell, demanding he get back to Hampton Court as fast as possible, quote, to comfort our good master, for as our mistress there is no likelihood of her life, the more pity, and I fear she shall not be alive at the time ye shall read this, end quote. He was right. That night, around midnight, Jane died. News of the Queen's death provoked a sense of national mourning on a scale not previously witnessed in Tudor England. The aforementioned in the show, Richard Morrison, a pamphleteer with responsibility for government propaganda, attempting to alleviate the sorrow of his fellow Englishmen, composed a, quote, comfortable consolation wherein the people may see how far greater causes they have to be glad for the birth of Prince Edward than sorry for the death of Queen Jane, end quote. This contained a totally made-up, fictitious, 7-page speech from the Queen, quote, as if she could speak to us, end quote. This included Jane's supposedly dying wish to the nation. Again, I'll read it to you, but it's totally fabricated. I have left you, me babe. In this nonage, I shall think your love implied to the profit of mine heir, if you give it all to his father. For Morrison, even in death, there was an advantage to be had, and he took it. After Jane's body had been embalmed, she lay in state, crowned and bejeweled, for about 3 weeks. Then finally, on November 8th, her coffin was interred in Windsor. Of course, Edward was an infant and could not understand the ramifications of any of this. He couldn't understand anything. He would later write in his diary, however, that for the first 6 years of his life, he was raised, quote, among the women, end quote. There's nothing unusual at all about this during the early modern age, but it's worth pointing out how secluded Henry kept his son, how little time he spent with him during his formative years. And part of this is because of Jane's death. was because Henry was absolutely terrified at the idea that something might happen to his son. Henry was, of course, a hypochondriac, and certainly imprinted this paranoia onto his son. Security around the Prince of Wales was the tightest it could have been for the pre-modern world. No one under the rank of knight was allowed to be in Edward's presence. He could consume no food unless large quantities of it were first eaten by several other people. His clothing was washed and then worn by someone else before Edward could put it on. Despite Henry's concern, he was very much an absent parent during his son's life. We have one record of a day visit between Henry and Edward in May of 1538. But that's about it. Rather, it was Mary, Edward's half-sister, who took it upon herself to visit her royal brother. Mary always showed genuine interest in Edward, paying him visits in November 1537 and then again in the spring, visiting in March, April, and then again in May. Edward was now becoming a toddler. Paying a visit to his country nursery, the Lord Chancellor Thomas Audley reported back to Cromwell that the Hertfordshire heir was doing him good. He had grown, losing his baby fat, and, quote, waxeth firm and stiff, end quote. Edward could now stand unaided and would probably be able to walk soon. Nevertheless, Audley approved of his care, quote, they do yet best, considering his grace is yet tender, that he should not strain himself, as his own courage would serve him, till he come above a year of age, end quote. The prince was to be moved from his current residence before the winter set in, to which Audley fully agreed. Quote, it would be a cold house in the winter, though in summer it is good air, end quote. For the next few years, Edward's household led an itinerant journey through some of the many small royal palaces and hunting lodges that Henry possessed on the outskirts of London. It was a life devoted to leisure and enjoyment. On his removal to Hudson around Easter 1540, someone wrote to Cromwell informing him that she was accustomed to Edward's good progress. She wrote, quote, my Lord Prince Grace is in good health, Mary. His Grace danced and played so wantonly that he could not stand still, and was as full of pretty toys as I ever saw a child in my life, end quote. Lady Mary continued her visits, spoiling her brother with presents. Princess Elizabeth was less generous, though her gifts were no less thoughtful. Edward's health continued to be a subject of close scrutiny. Every waking hour of his life he was carefully monitored by doctors who swarmed around him, constantly checking his temperature and fussing over what he might or might not eat. The prince's health seemed good, with the French ambassador reporting in October 1541 that Edward was, quote, handsome, well-fed, and remarkably tall for his age, end quote. But that very same month, Edward came down with what was called quarantine fever, which was a form of malaria. Henry became so distraught over the incident that even his appetite suffered. He was said to be, quote, sad and disinclined for feasting, end quote. In fear that he might lose his only son, he anxiously summoned the best doctors from across the country to discover a cure. For 10 days, it was uncertain whether Edward would survive. His rich and luxurious diet had not helped things. One of the doctors, who had been summoned to the royal court and had examined the prince for the first time, told the French ambassador that Edward was, quote, so gross and unhealthy that he could not believe, judging from what he could see now, that he would live long, end quote. Despite this rather gloomy prediction, however, Edward threw off the illness, even though in April 1542, doctors continued to predict he would live a short life. Now desperate to aid his son's recovery, King Henry sent his own personal doctor, a guy by the name of William Butts, to Edward's side. Butts visited frequently, and it was not long before his manners began to annoy the prince, who was now confined to soups and broths, and had a craving for meat. Edward's spirits, however, quickly picked up and improved. Butts finally allowed Edward to eat his coveted dish, which was so rich it almost immediately induced him to vomit. But by now, fed up with Butts fussing around him, Edward had become impatient, telling the doctor to go away. It was a clear and reassuring sign, Butts concluded, that Edward's strengths were fully recovered and that his work there was done. Finally, in 1543, Edward was given a chance to spend more time with his father. In the fall, his household was moved into a house neighboring that of Henry's. That spring, Parliament passed another act of succession, this time confirming the order of succession from Edward to Mary and then finally Elizabeth. Henry had big plans for his son. The Scottish King James V died in December 1542, 3 weeks after his crushing defeat at Sulieman. Henry hoped to marry his son to the infant Queen of Scotland, Mary. As we already know, that was not to be. As I mentioned more on Mary, Queen of Scots, later. In April 1544, however, the Scottish Parliament rejected union with England and instead renewed its old alliance with France. Henry was enraged. He immediately ordered Edinburgh put to the sword, and the rough wooing of Scotland had begun. By the summer of 1544, Edward finally moved into Hampton Court. For the first time, an official court would be established around him. Edward was now 6 years old, entering his first state of manhood. This also marked the beginning of his formal education. Richard Cox was appointed his tutor, with John Checkey as his deputy. Edward's tutors would be a major source of contention in the years to come. Now, in Henry's eyes, his son was already the greatest king in Christendom. Parents, however, see what they want to see sometimes. I can certainly attest to that. It was also now that Edward started to make some lifelong friends. Notable among them were Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, and Barnaby Fitzpatrick. Both men would be major influences over the young prince throughout much of his regency. We know Edward enjoyed music and singing. Catherine Parr, Henry's final wife, encouraged Edward's humanist education. And she's also going to continue to be a key player in our story moving forward. In fact, you could make the argument that the most important of Henry's wives was one of those who did not give him a child, Catherine Parr. She would outlive the old king and be one of those with an inordinate influence over Edward going forward. By 1546, Edward had matured into a diligent student. He would remain so throughout his life, and I certainly wonder whether he would have preferred the life of a scholar to that of a prince. Away from his studies, Edward continued to enjoy a strong relationship with his sisters. Elizabeth, in fact, may have joined him in some of his studies. But according to all the records, Edward preferred the company of his older sister, Mary. Edward was always protective of his oldest sister, even when she vexed him. Edward begged Mary to stop hearing Mass at one point, not that it mattered. Edward's strong Protestant opinions still had yet to form. For the moment, his beliefs still revolved around the Catholic faith. He attended Mass and walked through rooms adorned with sacred images. Now finally, in 1546, Henry decided that Edward should perform his first official state duty. He would receive a French ambassador. It was, of course, a good decision. Henry had less than 1 year to live. The final year of Henry's life was one of desperate uncertainty. The king, in control to the last, had become incredibly unstable. His instability heightened by the continuous pain from varicose ulcers in his legs. Unable to walk, he was carried about by trams that shuttled him up and down the corridors of Westminster Palace, and he suffered from frequent bouts of fever. it was clear to everyone that Henry's reign was coming to an end. No one could be sure which direction events might take. As we know, the court began to fracture into a veritable kaleidoscope of alliances, broadly forming into two separate factions. On the one hand, we have the conservatives, who espoused the traditional values of the Catholic religion, and were embodied in the Howards, Thomas, Duke of Norfolk, and his son Henry, the Earl of Surrey. Up against them was, I guess, what we would call the evangelical faction. These were mostly new men who had risen up through the court as a result of Henry's favor, men like Edward Seymour, Earl of Hereford, and the rising courtier, John Dudley, and of course, the King's Royal Secretary, William Paget. These bonds were by no means static, and alliances were subject to change, much on the basis of personality, as any sincerely held belief. There was, however, one common aim in everyone's mind. Whoever gained access to the dying Henry sought not only to influence his judgment during this reign, but to control his son in the next. Everything was to play for. At the beginning of the year, it seemed like the conservatives had the upper hand. And there were rumors all over the place that Henry might even return to the papal obedience. There was a plot engineered to bring down Catherine Parr, thought to be an evangelical, attempting to persuade Henry that she was a heretic. But this all fell on deaf ears, and Henry suddenly made another of his spectacular about-faces, telling an astonished Cranmer that he wished to see the Mass abolished within 6 months. But what or who had made him change his mind? Henry's reluctant decision to abandon his hopes of conquest and military glory in France almost certainly had something to do with it. The end of the war brought with it the return of two of Henry's favorite courtiers and companions, the aforementioned Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, and John Dudley. Edward Seymour's position amongst the nobility was unique. He was the older brother of the deceased Jane Seymour, and therefore the prince's uncle. The king held him in close regard, raising him to an earldom in 1537. Seymour could be proud, tactless, and lacking in popularity. Often he alienated his fellow courtiers, particularly members of the older nobility, who regarded him as an upstart. But no one could deny that Seymour was a brilliant soldier, renowned for excellent military leadership. Unlike Seymour, Dudley could not count on family ties for influence. His father, Edmund Dudley, had been one of Henry VII's deeply unpopular chief ministers, and was executed for treason upon the accession of Henry VIII. At that time, John Dudley was only 6 years old. Adopted by Sir Edward Guilford, who persuaded the king to reverse the Act of Attainder against the Dudley family and had his property returned 2 years later. Dudley then slowly found favor at court, and by 1542 he had been elevated to the nobility. His military reputation, both at land and sea, continued to excel, culminating in his appointment as Lord Admiral in March of 1546. Edward Seymour wrote admiringly of Dudley to the king, quote, "I can do no less than to recommend him unto your highness, as one that has served you heartily, wisely, diligently, painfully, and obediently as any as I have seen." End quote. Once they returned from France, Seymour and Dudley immediately took their places as the king's closest advisor, holding the king's ear as they whiled away hours playing cards. Neither probably cared much either way about the direction that religion might take. They were perfectly content to follow whatever course Henry chose. But it was the threat of the Howards, their great political rivals, that ultimately drove them into the evangelical camp. Both realized that if they were to secure their political survival into Edward's reign, it would be impossible not to choose sides. Fortunately, both men had a common ally, Sir William Paget, the king's secretary, whose reputation for secrecy and political maneuver would later earn him the title the Master of Practices. And it was to him they turned to for a solution. Naturally, Paget already had a plan in mind to bring about the final downfall of the Howards. While the elder Howard was powerful and probably untouchable, his son, Henry, Earl of Surrey, was a brash and volatile young man, confident that he could always fall back on his exalted family background. But Surrey's foolhardiness on the battlefield in France had cost him his position as a lieutenant of the king's forces, and probably more importantly, the king's favor. Bitter and resentful that his inferiors, whom he deemed Seymour and Dudley, should be promoted above him, Surrey grumbled to a friend how, quote, these new erected men would by their wiles leave no nobleman on life, end quote. As the evangelicals grew ever more powerful at court, Surrey's behavior merely alienated him even further from his enemies. Fast becoming a scapegoat, he was unaware of the forces being ranged against him. He even wrote to Paget addressing him as his friend, and later attempted to win his support by offering him the position of chancellor. Paget had other ideas in mind, though. As early as 1545, he had been sending Seymour letters urging him to befriend others at court, particularly those who had valuable personal contact with Henry. Soon, with the secretary's help, Seymour presided at the head of a faction determined to imprint their dominance upon the court in spite of any who opposed them. Despite the fact that all signs pointed to the rise of the evangelical faction within Henry's court, nothing could be taken for granted. Henry had seemed to favor the reform movement in the past, only to backtrack at the last moment. But in October 1546, the conservatives led by the Howard finally lost control over the Privy Chamber to the evangelicals. This seemed like the turning point at last. In December of that year, the council began abandoning the ailing king altogether, meeting in Seymour's house instead. Around that time, there was already talk that, quote, there will be a change of religion in England, and the king will take up the gospel of Christ, end quote. While the chance was there, there was every opportunity for Henry to change his mind again. Paget, Seymour, and the other evangelicals decided to strike first and secure their dominance of court, finally bringing the end to the conservative faction. They had good reason to be optimistic, for they had been aided now by the defections of Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and Richard Southwell to their cause. Both men were Catholics, however, they realized which way the wind was blowing, and was often the case during the twists and turns of the Reformation, religious allegiances just become subordinated to the desire for power. Though they were Catholics, the two men were welcomed into the fold, for between them they had what the evangelicals had been looking for, evidence that would destroy the Earl of Surrey and finally bring down the Howards. On December the 2nd, Southwell told the council he had information concerning the Earl of Surrey, quote, that touched the fidelity to the king, end quote. Surrey was arrested and taken for examination at Wriothesley's house, while the Howard family home at Kennington, Norfolk, was raided at the king's agents in a quest for evidence. What they discovered there, they claimed, was undoubted proof that Southwell was correct, for its walls had been newly decorated with heraldic badges displaying the letters H and R on either side of a broken pedestal, with the royal arms in the top. In an age when visual imagery was a vivid representation of meaning and intent, this, the government claimed, could be taken as nothing less than treason. HR stood for Henricus Rex, with the broken pillar a representative of the ruined Commonwealth vanished by the Tudors, but restored under the Howards. Surrey later denied the charge, claiming that the pillar represented his own noble house, broken by the king's might, with the HR standing for Hereditas Estat, but no one believed him. Besides, fresh investigations had discovered that Surrey had taken to quartering his arms and his heraldic shield with those of Edward the Confessor. In effect, he was claiming that the Howards had as equal a claim to the throne as the Tudors themselves. Although told by the herald Garter, King of Arms, that it was not his honor to do so, Surrey refused to listen. Surrey's sister recalled how the Earl had worn, quote, a cap of maintenance purple with a crown, and underneath the arms of the cipher, which she took to be the king's cipher, HR. Another close friend further admitted that Surrey had told him his father was, quote, most meet to rule the prince, end quote. But in the end, it was the testimony of Surrey's sister that her brother had urged her, quote, to delight the king, end quote, with sexual favors in an attempt to control him, that put the verdict beyond any reasonable doubt. By the 12th of December 1546, the coup was nearly complete. Surrey and Norfolk were imprisoned in the Tower. Surrey was tried on the 13th of January 1547 in the Great Hall. He spoke from 9 in the morning to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Remaining proud to the last, he denied every charge, though a last-minute confession from his father in the Tower sealed his fate. Found guilty, Surrey was led back to the Tower, ranting against the quote-unquote conjured league that had destroyed him. He was executed 6 days later. King Henry had been horrified by Surrey's actions and was reported to have been, quote, much perplexed, end quote, by the whole affair. His health was declining. He now remained secluded in his bedchamber, surrounded by only a few trusted courtiers. On the 24th of December, 1546, he had spent 3 hours going through the accusations leveled against Surrey. Knowing the end of his life was near, Henry must have realized exactly what was at stake. For though he was not yet in the grave, already the fate of his son was at risk. Too young to rule himself, Edward would be an easy target for the unbridled ambitions of politicians and courtiers. And he would remain so unless precise guidelines could be drawn up on how a regency council should rule during this minority. And so Henry decided to act. He would make one final, last will and testament, outlining his intentions in full. This was exactly what Paget and the evangelicals had been hoping for, the chance to permanently exclude the conservatives from government. For though Henry may have believed that his own supremacy left him fully in control, the reality was far different. Henry had now become a puppet in the hands of those closest to him. His very thoughts and intentions manipulated with a subtlety that even the most astute struggled to realize. In the event of the succession of a minor, the 1536 Act of Succession had empowered Henry to name a council of guardians, appointed by his last will as his executors. The list had remained unaltered since Henry last drew up his will upon his departure for France 2 years earlier in 1544. But now all this was going to change, for Henry told his attendants that he wanted to revise the list, with certain names, quote, he meant to have in and some he meant to have out, end quote. Going through the checklist, Sir Anthony Browne, the master of the horse and a renowned conservative, was the first to notice the change. Suddenly, the name of Stephen Gardiner, the conservative Bishop of Winchester, had been removed. Had he been forgotten? But Henry had not forgotten Gardiner the bishop. He had left him out deliberately, he told Browne, for he was so stubborn that he thought no man would be able to control him. But Browne did not take the hint and continued, asking the king, quote, have you not yet done to molest me in this manner? End quote. Henry retorted, threatening to throw Brown out of his bedchamber. Henry knew exactly what he was doing. He had also removed the name of the Bishop of Westminster, since he had been taught by Gardiner. When the new list of executors was finally completed, the men who would hold real power under the beginning of Edward's reign, it read like a roll call of those either supportive of or compliant to Seymour and Paget's faction. The new will, written out under Paget's dictation, was ready by the 30th of December.